August 2nd, 2025. The morning sky over Ouagadougou didn't just carry the dry winds of the Sahel, it roared a deep thundering sound as a JF-17 Thunder fighter jet tore through the air. This was no training exercise, no diplomatic pageantry with flags and red carpets. This was a real combat aircraft delivered straight from Pakistan to President IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso, not sold, not leased, and not bound by conditions. A single 22-second video filmed from behind the chain-link fence of Ouagadougou's military airstrip was enough to make intelligence officers from Brussels to Washington sit up. The JF-17, a supersonic multi-role fighter capable of air-to-air combat precision strikes and electronic warfare, now appeared alongside the red, green, and gold of a nation long underestimated. In an era when many African leaders still receive military aid with strings attached from Western powers, IBRAHIM Traoré took delivery of a fighter jet in silence on his own terms. No press conference, no permission slip from NATO, no apologies. But is this simply a gesture of solidarity between nations of the global South? Or is it the first sign of a defense realignment bold enough to challenge the West's monopoly over African skies? And if one single aircraft can shift the way an entire continent sees itself, what else is being built in the shadows that the world hasn't yet seen? This was more than a delivery. It was a message, one that spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, igniting pride, debate, and speculation across the African digital sphere. And now the question isn't just whether the jet is real, but whether this moment marks the beginning of something Africa has never dared to fly before. Stay with us as we unpack the story behind those 22 seconds to understand why a blurry clip could shake the halls of power, capture the imagination of millions, and send a message loud enough for the whole world to hear. It began with a grainy clip, 22 seconds long, shaky framed by the jagged wires of a chain-link fence at Ouagadougou's military airstrip. In the center of the shot, a fighter jet glistened in the early Sahel light, its nose angled slightly down as ground crews wheeled it into a secure hangar. The markings were unmistakable, the green crescent of the Pakistan Air Force still painted across its tail. The whisper of the person filming, "They gave it to him," crackled faintly in the background. By 11:47 a.m., the video had already crossed 3 continents. WhatsApp groups in Accra shared it with captions like "Burkina rises." Telegram channels in Bamako reposted it under cryptic emojis of wings and fire. TikTok creators in Nairobi slowed the footage down and overlaid it with IBRAHIM Traoré's past speeches about sovereignty and dignity. On X, formerly Twitter, the clip made its way to timelines in Johannesburg, Istanbul, and even parts of Washington, D.C. As defense-watching community, it didn't matter that the audio was muffled or that no official statement confirmed the event. The symbolism was crystal clear: a next-generation fighter jet not from Paris or Washington, but from Pakistan, parked on Burkina soil. By nightfall, hashtags had erupted across the African digital sphere. Traoré takes flight, JF-17 for Africa. And the most poetic of them all, chasing the jet often paired with memes showing Traoré in a desert cape standing beside a jet, the caption reading, "If they bring war, we bring wings." The numbers were staggering: over 18 million views in less than 12 hours. Youth influencers in Kinshasa and Lusaka posted reaction videos. Political satirists in Lagos mocked Western media silence with skits titled, "Nothing to See Here." Even respected journalists from Al Jazeera and TRT reposted the footage with the tantalizing tagline, "Unconfirmed, but undeniable." For much of the African public, there was no need for confirmation. In their eyes, the scene represented something far bigger than a military upgrade. This was about agency, the right to choose alliances without asking permission from old colonial capitals. The image of a JF-17 in Burkina Faso sliced through decades of dependency, replacing them, if only for a moment, with the idea that Africa could stand on its own wings. In the streets of Ouagadougou, young men and women crowded around phones outside cafes and market stalls, replaying the video again and again. Some broke into spontaneous cheers, others stood quietly staring at the tiny screen as if memorizing every detail. In Dakar, a group of university students streamed a live discussion breaking down the JF-17's technical specifications alongside quotes from African independence leaders. In Lusaka, a poet uploaded verses comparing the fighter jet to the voice of Thomas Sankara flying again over the Sahel. And yet, as the public euphoria grew, defense analysts began sounding cautious notes. Burkina Faso, they pointed out, had no supersonic jet fleet, no documented JF-17 trained pilots, and no airbase infrastructure built for such an aircraft. The country's existing air force operated light surveillance planes and helicopters, nothing in the category of a fourth-generation fighter. None of that seemed to matter to the millions sharing the video. In the age of instant media, belief can spread faster than verification. The jet, whether operational or not, had already achieved what no press release could. It had shifted the conversation from dependency to self-determination. As one Burkina blogger wrote that evening, even if it was CGI, it reminded us that we deserve more than hand-me-downs and apologies. That was the heartbeat of the day, not whether the jet could fly combat missions tomorrow, but that a nation long underestimated could even be imagined as having such power. And in the global south, where stories of sovereignty often struggle to break through global headlines, 22 seconds of blurry footage had become a rallying point. The morning of August 2nd was no longer just about a plane. It was about possibility. By late afternoon on August 2nd, the story had left Ouagadougou far behind. The JF-17 was no longer just parked on a Burkina airstrip, it was soaring through the digital stratosphere. Every new share, every repost layered the story with more drama, more speculation, more pride. In Nairobi, a TikTok remix of the landing went viral, slow-motion footage of the jet's nose dipping as it rolled onto the tarmac, set to IBRAHIM Traoré's voice declaring, "We will never kneel again." In Lagos, a political cartoon depicted Western diplomats in panic watching a small African plane morph into an eagle, blotting out the sun. In Johannesburg, a community radio host broke from the day's sports segment to tell listeners, if this is real, then the map of Africa's defense just changed. The hashtags were now trending not just in Africa, but in parts of Asia and the Middle East. Traore takes flight was picked up by youth groups in Karachi and Ankara, while JF-17 for Africa made appearances on Chinese-language defense forums. On Instagram, digital artists from Tunisia to Tanzania redrew the African continent with bold new air corridors, weaving Burkina Faso into a tapestry of imagined Global South military strength. And then came the debates. On African news panels, defense analysts argued over the plausibility of the gift. A JF-17 isn't a pickup truck you can hand over with a set of keys, one Nigerian expert said. It's a system pilots ground crews radar supply lines. Burkina Faso has none of that yet. A French military commentator scoffed, symbolic yes, operational absolutely not. But each attempt to puncture the balloon seemed only to make it rise higher. For ordinary Africans, the questions of feasibility mattered less than the feeling. In Ouagadougou's markets, merchants paused between sales to watch the clip on loop. In Dakar's coffee shops, young professionals debated what it meant for Africa to bypass the traditional Western arms pipeline. In Bamako street, musicians composed impromptu songs about the wings of Traore. By evening, political leaders began weighing in carefully. A Malian minister posted a cryptic message, "When the winds change, even the smallest wings can cross oceans." A Ghanaian MP tweeted, "The youth see hope where analysts see hardware. That should tell us something." Western reactions were more restrained but tinged with unease. Defense blogs in Washington dissected the clip frame by frame, noting the lack of visible tail numbers or re-registration marks. A NATO-affiliated think tank released a brief warning about the optics of unsanctioned military transfers in the Sahel. And in Paris, a retired Air Force general told a radio interviewer, even if the jet is just for show, it shows too much. The emotional peak came when a still image from the video, the jet half in shadow, half in sunlight, was paired with a quote attributed to Thomas Sankara, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." Within hours, the image was everywhere. It became a poster, a meme, a phone wallpaper. To many, it didn't matter if Sankara had ever said it. What mattered was how it felt like a passing of the torch from one revolutionary moment to another. Meanwhile, the more skeptical voices dug deeper. They pointed out that no official records existed in the UN Arms Trade Treaty Registry, nor in the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute database of any Pakistani aircraft transfer to Burkina Faso. They compared satellite images of Kambansam Air Base, noting its lack of hardened shelters or advanced radar arrays capable of supporting a fourth-generation fighter. But the counter-arguments could not keep pace with the memes. One in particular crystallized the mood, a split screen showing the jet in Burkina Faso on one side and a photo of colonial troops marching in the 1880s on the other. The caption read, "Then they brought chains. Now we bring wings." Even in corners of the diaspora, the clip was sparking pride. African-American activists in Atlanta shared it alongside calls for closer ties with African nations. Caribbean radio shows debated whether this represented a broader global South awakening. And on certain Pan-African forums, the JF-17 was already being mythologized as the Thunder of the Sahel. This was the climax of the story, not the delivery of a machine, but the ignition of a feeling. A fighter jet, real or not, had tapped into something dormant, the hunger for sovereignty, the thrill of defiance, the belief that Africa could break the old rules. For those in power, this was a communications wildfire, a single unverified video rewriting narratives at the speed of a share button. For the people, it was something simpler. It was the vision of Africa not asking for permission. By the end of August the 2nd, the reality of the jet still hung in the balance. But the emotional verdict was already in. And it was decisive. By dawn on August 3rd, the JF-17 wasn't just an internet sensation, it had seeped into the conversations of markets classrooms, radio talk shows, and government offices across Africa. The ripples were no longer confined to military speculation. They were shifting how people thought about themselves, their countries, and their continent. In Ouagadougou, street vendors began selling T-shirts with silhouettes of the jet printed over the Burkina flag. In Bamako, young graffiti artists painted murals of a JF-17 with the words "No more permission slips" splashed in bold red. High school debate clubs in Accra and Addis Ababa used the clip as a case study in sovereignty through symbolism. Even in refugee camps along Burkina Faso's northern border, aid workers reported hearing children shouting thunder as they played. It didn't matter that no one could confirm whether the plane was operational. For many, the symbolism was already doing its work, injecting a sense of capability and dignity into a region too often spoken of in terms of dependency, instability, or need. It was as if the collective imagination had been given a new vocabulary, wing, speed, sky choice. Within Burkina Faso's political circles, the leadership faced a careful balancing act. On one hand, the viral momentum served their narrative perfectly that the country under IBRAHIM Traoré was charting its own course free from Western dictates. On the other, the lack of verifiable facts meant the administration had to avoid being cornered into confirming or denying details that could create diplomatic friction. The official government statement issued 48 hours later was telling in its ambiguity. It praised the strengthening of defense relations with partners of the Global South and affirmed Burkina Faso's right to defend its skies and its sovereignty. But there was no direct mention of Pakistan the JF-17 or any transfer agreement. The silence was strategic, allowing the narrative to breathe while keeping the facts deniable. In neighboring Mali and Niger, leaders from the AES Alliance of Sahel states quietly capitalized on the moment. They referenced the winds of change in public speeches, subtly framing the viral jet as a symbol for broader Sahel unity against foreign interference. The story also introduced new fault lines with Western capitals. French media ran skeptical op-eds questioning the credibility of the footage and warning about destabilizing myths. In Washington, policy analysts debated whether such viral narratives could undermine carefully managed security arrangements in the Sahel. Some argued that even false perceptions of military capability could embolden governments to reject Western military aid packages or negotiate from a stronger position. The optics were particularly sensitive for France, whose forces had been expelled from Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership. The image of a high-tech jet potentially from non-Western partners resonated like a quiet but deliberate provocation. Perhaps the most profound political consequence was how the clip fed into the broader Pan-African discourse. On talk shows in Lagos and Kigali, commentators began using the jet as shorthand for Africa's right to acquire modern tools without external approval. Writers in Nairobi and Cape Town published essays arguing that the continent's real struggle wasn't to own specific weapons, but to reclaim the agency to decide who its partners should be. In the African Union corridors, some diplomats reportedly discussed off-record the need to embrace narratives of capability as part of the continent's diplomatic toolkit. The idea was simple: if perception shapes power, Africa should not shy away from symbols that challenge the world's assumptions. But with the excitement came danger. In villages affected by insurgent violence, some citizens interpreted the viral clip as proof that new decisive air power was now available to protect them. Humanitarian groups warned of the backlash if these expectations went unmet. Hope can lift people, one aid worker in Soum province said, but false hope can break them twice. The government, aware of this delicate balance, avoided letting the narrative spin into outright promises of air dominance. Still, the momentum was hard to contain. For many, the jet had already taken off not in the sky but in the mind. What began as an unverified 22-second video was now shaping civil identity, diplomatic positioning, and political discourse. It was a masterclass, intentional or not, in narrative power, using a single symbol to bridge the gap between aspiration and action. The JF-17 might never fly a mission over the Sahel, but politically it had already landed on posters, in speeches, and in the stubborn belief that Africa doesn't have to wait its turn to command the skies. In Washington, the JF-17 clip wasn't treated like a mere social media oddity. Within hours of its circulation, it had landed on the desks of defense analysts at the Pentagon and think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The conversation was not about whether Burkina Faso had truly acquired a fourth-generation fighter jet, but about the optics of the claim and what it could mean for U.S. influence in the Sahel. One internal briefing reportedly described the moment as a perception event with potential strategic impact. Translation: even if the jet never existed, the belief that it might could still alter regional politics. If African publics saw new non-Western partners as willing to deliver high-grade military assets without political strings, it could erode the leverage Washington has long relied on in security negotiations. From a broader U.S. policy angle, the viral nature of the story raised uncomfortable questions. In the age of TikTok diplomacy, could narrative power, the ability to shape perceptions instantly, now rival the hard power of actual military deployments? And if so, could Washington's careful messaging about stability and democracy keep pace with a continent increasingly moved by images, symbols, and defiance? In Europe, the reaction was equally wary. French defense commentators spoke openly about the return of the optics war, recalling how Cold War-era propaganda sometimes mattered as much as troop movements. The possibility that Burkina Faso, a country that had expelled French forces, could now appear aligned with new military suppliers from Asia was seen as a blow to Paris's already strained standing in West Africa. In Asia, the response was more layered. Pakistani commentators celebrated the clip as an example of strategic outreach to the global south, whether officially sanctioned or not. Chinese state-linked analysts framed it as proof that Western monopoly on African military procurement was breaking down. In Moscow, media close to the Kremlin speculated that the jet, real or symbolic, signaled the deepening of a non-Western security bloc in the Sahel. Across the global south, the mood was strikingly different from the skepticism in Western capitals. In Latin America, alternative media outlets praised the moment as a small but powerful crack in the global hierarchy. Southeast Asian bloggers drew parallels to their own histories of resisting Western dominance. For the U.S., the takeaway was sobering. The real battleground may no longer be in controlling the supply of weapons, but in controlling the stories told about them. And in this case, the story, whether rooted in fact or fiction, had already slipped beyond the reach of traditional power brokers. The August 2nd JF-17 moment may never be fully untangled. Perhaps it was a genuine transfer, a covert deal shielded from public records. Perhaps it was a stage-managed stunt designed to plant an idea in the minds of millions. Or perhaps it was something in between, part truth, part theater, entirely strategic. What is certain is that the 22 seconds of shaky footage achieved what many full-scale military operations never could. It shifted how people saw Burkina Faso, and by extension, how they saw Africa's place in the world. The jet, real or not, ignited debates in parliaments, fueled pan-African pride, unsettled Western policymakers, and inspired art, poetry, and political commentary across continents. But with inspiration comes risk. A symbol that lifts spirits can also create expectations. In parts of the Sahel where insurgent attacks are a weekly reality, some citizens believed that new air power was now in play, ready to protect them. If that belief proves false, it could breed disappointment, cynicism, and a loss of trust in leadership. Narrative victories are powerful, but they require careful handling lest they turn from rallying cries into empty echoes. There's also a larger question hanging in the air in the 21st century. Will the contests that define global power be fought more in the skies or in the stories told about those skies? When perception itself becomes a strategic asset, smaller nations may find they can compete with great powers not by matching their arsenals, but by mastering their narratives. That's both an opportunity and a warning. For the United States and its allies, the lesson is clear control of the physical battlefield is no longer enough. The battle for perception is faster, more unpredictable, and far harder to win with traditional diplomacy. And for Africans watching from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg, from Bamako to Nairobi, the message of August 2nd is equally clear. Sovereignty is as much about who tells your story as it is about what sits on your runway. So we leave you with this: if a single unverified clip can shake confidence in old power structures and plant the seeds of a new African narrative, what might happen when the symbols are matched by reality? Please share this story if you believe that Africa's right to defend itself should never depend on the approval of foreign capitals. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, whether it flies in steel or in spirit, matters more than the headlines.